The morning light filtered through the porthole of the cramped compartment aboard the carrier Zuikaku as Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stared at the intelligence report in his hands. The date was June 20th, 1944, and the waters of the Philippine Sea still churned with the debris of what his pilots were already calling a massacre. Spread before him on the metal desk were reconnaissance photographs and status reports that told a story his superiors in Tokyo did not want to hear. Of the 473 carrier aircraft he had launched into battle just hours before, fewer than 130 had returned. 3 of his carriers rested at the bottom of the Pacific, and according to the latest intelligence assessment, the Americans had suffered losses so minimal they were almost insulting. 23 aircraft, 23, against his nearly 400. But it was not the battle statistics that held Ozawa's attention in that dim morning hour. It was the construction report. Someone in naval intelligence had compiled the numbers, and now they sat before him in stark, undeniable columns. Since the disaster at Midway 2 years prior, Japan had strained every resource, commandeered every shipyard, and mobilized every available engineer to rebuild its carrier force. The report showed the results. 6 carriers completed and commissioned, 6 ships to replace the catastrophic losses of 1942. Ozawa's finger traced down to the second column, the one marked with the American flag. 24 Essex-class carriers, not planned, not proposed, completed, operational. And the report estimated another dozen would enter service before the war's end. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ozawa had known the Americans possessed industrial might. Every officer who had served in the pre-war Navy understood this. On an intellectual level, Admiral Yamamoto himself had warned the government that any extended conflict with the United States would be decided not by courage or tactical brilliance, but by the productive capacity of factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and the shipyards of Newport News. But knowing a fact and confronting its material reality were entirely different experiences. Looking at those numbers, Ozawa understood with crystalline clarity that Japan had not been fighting a war. It had been fighting mathematics. The story of how Japan's naval leadership came to confront this brutal arithmetic begins not in the defeat of June 1944, but in the intoxicating victories of December 1941. When Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, the Imperial Japanese Navy represented the most sophisticated carrier force in the world. 9 carriers prowled the Pacific, supported by the most advanced naval aircraft of the era, flown by pilots with years of combat experience over China. The Mitsubishi Zero dominated the skies. Japanese torpedoes were the most reliable and deadly in any navy's arsenal. And the doctrine of massed carrier operations, the Kido Butai, was a Japanese innovation that the Americans were only beginning to comprehend. In those first 6 months, Japanese carrier forces appeared unstoppable. The 6 fleet carriers of the Kido Butai ranged across half the globe, from Hawaii in the east to Ceylon in the west. They supported the invasions of the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. British capital ships, the Prince of Wales and Repulse, fell to Japanese naval bombers in a display that shocked the world and seemed to herald the obsolescence of the battleship. The Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet retreated from the Indian Ocean after Japanese carriers struck Ceylon with devastating effect. American, British, and Dutch naval forces were scattered or destroyed in a series of engagements that seemed to validate every claim of Japanese tactical superiority. But even in those heady days of victory, some voices expressed caution. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, privately harbored profound misgivings. Yamamoto had spent years in the United States as a naval attaché. He had visited the automobile factories of Detroit, toured the steel mills of Pennsylvania, and walked through the shipyards that lined American coasts. He had seen firsthand the industrial infrastructure that undergirded American society. When asked about his confidence in victory, Yamamoto gave responses that disturbed his more hawkish colleagues. He stated he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, he expressed no expectation of success. He emphasized that Japan's only path to victory required forcing America to negotiate before its full industrial might could be mobilized. The problem, Yamamoto understood, was that Japan's entire strategic concept rested on a psychological assumption that was proving incorrect. The plan had been to inflict such sharp, painful defeats on American forces that the public would lose stomach for a long Pacific War and pressure their government to accept a negotiated peace that recognized Japanese conquests. This strategy had worked for Japan before. In 1905, the stunning naval victory at Tsushima had broken Russian will to continue the Russo-Japanese War, leading to a favorable peace settlement. Japanese planners believed the same pattern could be repeated, but Pearl Harbor, rather than demoralizing America, had unified it. The attack that was meant to cripple American naval power in the Pacific instead became the catalyst that unleashed the very industrial mobilization Yamamoto had feared. President Roosevelt called it a date which would live in infamy, and the American public responded not with calls for peace, but with determination, for total victory. Within weeks, American factories began converting to war production on a scale that would have seemed fantastical to pre-war observers. The Japanese naval staff's understanding of American productive capacity was not entirely absent. Various intelligence assessments had attempted to quantify American industrial strength, but these reports often failed to convey the magnitude of disparity or were discounted by officers who preferred to focus on tactical and spiritual factors. The prevailing attitude in much of the Japanese officer corps emphasized fighting spirit, the warrior ethos of Bushido, and the superiority of Japanese training and discipline. These factors, many believed, would compensate for any material disadvantages. The first 6 months of the war seemed to confirm this view. Japanese forces advanced according to schedule, often ahead of it. The defensive perimeter expanding across the Pacific appeared to be developing as planned. American resistance, while fierce in places like Wake Island and Bataan, ultimately crumbled under Japanese pressure. The United States Pacific Fleet, its battleship force crippled at Pearl Harbor, seemed unable to contest Japanese advances effectively. But even as Japanese forces celebrated their conquests, the arithmetic was already working against them. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not sunk a single American aircraft carrier. By chance, not by American design, all 3 Pacific Fleet carriers were at sea on December 7th. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. The Saratoga was in San Diego. These 3 ships, along with carriers in the Atlantic that could be transferred to the Pacific, meant that America retained a core carrier force that could, if properly employed, challenge Japanese naval dominance. More significantly, the American shipbuilding program was already in motion before Pearl Harbor. The Essex-class carrier, destined to become the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific, had been designed in the late 1930s. The lead ship, USS Essex, had its keel laid in April 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor. When war came, the American government did not need to debate the value of carriers or design new classes of ships. They simply needed to accelerate production of vessels already in the pipeline. The acceleration proved breathtaking. American shipyards, operating under priority war contracts and supplied with seemingly unlimited resources, began producing Essex-class carriers at a pace that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. Where pre-war carriers like Yorktown and Enterprise had required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning, the Essex-class ships were completed in 16 to 20 months on average. USS Franklin held the record, built by Newport News Shipbuilding in just 14 months. This speed of construction was achieved, not through cutting corners but through innovations in shipyard practice, prefabrication of components, and the application of mass production principles pioneered in American automobile factories. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, was commissioned on December 31, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. She was followed in quick succession by Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, and others. By 1943, American shipyards were commissioning a new Essex-class carrier every 2 months on average. These were not small vessels. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 30,000 tons, carried up to 100 aircraft, and featured advanced radar systems, improved anti-aircraft defenses, and armor protection that made them remarkably survivable. Despite sustaining severe damage from kamikaze attacks and bombs, no Essex-class carrier would be sunk during the war. In contrast, Japan's carrier construction program struggled from the outset. At the time of Pearl Harbor, Japan was building exactly one purpose-built fleet carrier, Taiho. The Taiho's keel had been laid at Kawasaki in July 1941, making her construction contemporary with the early Essex-class ships. But where American shipyards would complete 17 Essex-class fleet carriers during the war, Taiho would be Japan's only purpose-built fleet carrier to reach commissioning. She took 32 months to complete, compared to 20 months for Essex, despite Essex being laid down just 3 months earlier. This difference in construction speed was not merely a matter of efficiency. It reflected fundamental disparities in industrial capacity, access to raw materials, and available skilled labor. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided the first indication that carrier warfare would be mutually costly. The Japanese light carrier Shoho was sunk, and the fleet carrier Shokaku was damaged. The Americans lost the fleet carrier, Lexington, and saw Yorktown damaged. As an engagement, Coral Sea was roughly a tactical draw, but it represented the first time Japanese naval expansion had been checked. More significantly for the American perspective, they had demonstrated they could engage Japanese carriers on roughly equal terms and inflict comparable losses. Then came Midway. On June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered its first decisive defeat of the war. Admiral Yamamoto had planned an operation to lure out and destroy the remaining American carriers, while simultaneously capturing Midway Island to extend Japan's defensive perimeter. American codebreakers had broken Japanese naval codes and knew the plan in advance. When Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched aircraft to attack Midway Island, American dive bombers caught 3 of them with their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. The resulting fires and explosions proved catastrophic. All 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk, along with a heavy cruiser. The Americans lost the Yorktown and a destroyer. Midway was a turning point not because it ended Japanese naval power, but because it began a process of attrition that Japan could not sustain. The 4 fleet carriers lost at Midway represented 2/3 of the elite Kido Butai. Replacing them would require years. More critically, the hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew lost in the battle could not be replaced at all. Japan's pilot training program, which had produced exceptionally skilled aviators before the war, was too slow and too rigorous to generate replacements at the rate combat was consuming them. After Midway, the Japanese Naval General Staff confronted a crisis. The defensive perimeter they had spent 6 months establishing was now vulnerable to American counterattack. The remaining carriers, spread across the Pacific, supporting various operations, could not concentrate effectively, and the Americans, their carrier force still numerically inferior but now operationally proven, were looking for opportunities to take the offensive. In response, the Japanese Navy embarked on an emergency carrier construction and conversion program. This program, formalized on June 30, 1942, reflected both the Navy's recognition of carrier importance and its fundamental misunderstanding of what would be required to compete with American production. The plan called for constructing 17 new carriers through 1948. 3 modified Taiho-class fleet carriers would be built, appearing in 1947 and 1948. 14 Unryu-class carriers, based on the pre-war Hiryu design but with improvements, would supplement the fleet starting in 1944. The plan looked impressive on paper, but it rested on assumptions that were already proving false. The program assumed access to steel from imported raw materials. By late 1942, American submarines were beginning to take a toll on Japanese merchant shipping, disrupting the flow of resources from conquered territories. The plan assumed sufficient industrial capacity from oil, hydroelectric, and coal power. But Japanese industry was already operating near maximum capacity, and the demands of army equipment, aircraft production, and other naval construction competed for the same limited resources. Most critically, the plan assumed several years of relatively stable conditions to complete construction. The war was not going to wait. The shipyards did their best. The first 3 Unryu-class carriers, Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi, had their keels laid between August and December 1942. But compared to American Essex-class vessels, the Unryu-class ships were compromises from the start. They displaced only 17,000 tons, significantly smaller than the 27,000-ton Essex class. They carried fewer aircraft and had less comprehensive defensive armament. And even these reduced specifications proved difficult to achieve. Material shortages forced yards to use engines originally built for cancelled cruisers. Steel plates earmarked for one project had to be diverted to another. Construction schedules slipped repeatedly. Meanwhile, American carrier construction accelerated. By August 1943, Essex and Yorktown had arrived in Pearl Harbor, ready for combat. They were joined by light carriers of the Independence class, converted from Cleveland-class cruiser hulls. These light carriers, while carrying fewer aircraft than fleet carriers, could still operate effectively with the main carrier task forces and added to American numerical superiority. By the end of 1943, the United States had more operational carriers in the Pacific than Japan had possessed at the beginning of the war. The American advantage was not merely numerical, it was systemic. American pilots, rotated back from combat zones to train new aviators, ensured that pilot quality remained high despite expansion. American aircraft, particularly the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter, incorporated lessons learned in combat and matched or exceeded Japanese aircraft in performance. American carrier doctrine emphasized centralized fighter direction using radar, coordinated multi-carrier strikes, and an integrated air defense system that proved devastatingly effective. And American logistics, the unglamorous but essential work of supplying, fueling, and maintaining the fleet at sea, was simply without precedent. Fleet oilers, ammunition ships, supply vessels, and repair ships allowed American carrier task forces to remain at sea for months at a time, striking wherever they chose, while Japanese forces, tied to limited fuel supplies and fixed bases, struggled to respond. As 1944 began, the strategic situation facing Japan had deteriorated markedly. American forces were advancing through the Central Pacific, taking the Gilbert Islands and preparing to assault the Marshalls. In the Southwest Pacific, American and Australian forces were pushing up the coast of New Guinea, isolating the major Japanese base at Rabaul. Japanese merchant losses to American submarines had become unsustainable, crippling the flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands, and making it increasingly difficult to fuel the fleet for major operations. And overhead, American aircraft from captured air bases and from the growing carrier force ranged at will, attacking Japanese positions with near impunity. The Japanese carrier force that remained was a shadow of the pre-war Kido Butai. The fleet carriers Shokaku and Zukaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were still in service, but their air groups were populated increasingly by inexperienced pilots. The new fleet carrier Taiho was finally completed in March 1944, after 32 months of construction. Several light carriers and converted carriers supplemented the force. But in aggregate, the Japanese carrier fleet that could be assembled for a major operation numbered 9 carriers capable of embarking approximately 450 aircraft. Critically, many of those aircraft were flown by pilots with minimal combat experience. The pre-war cadre of elite aviators, the men who had mastered their craft over years of training and combat in China, were largely gone, lost in the long campaign of attrition that had consumed them at Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons, and elsewhere. Against this diminished force, the United States Pacific Fleet could now array 15 carriers of the Fast Carrier Task Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, under the overall authority of Admiral Raymond Spruance. These carriers could launch over 900 aircraft, flown by well-trained pilots, supported by the most advanced radar and communication systems afloat. The disparity was not merely quantitative, it was qualitative, operational, and philosophical. American carrier operations had evolved into a sophisticated system of coordinated strikes, fighter sweeps, and defensive combat air patrols that maximized the combat power of each ship while minimizing vulnerability. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, who had assumed command of the combined fleet after Admiral Koga's death in March 1944, understood the desperation of Japan's position. He finalized a plan called A-Go, designed to force the decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine had always anticipated. The plan called for using land-based aircraft from island bases in coordination with the carrier fleet to overwhelm American forces. It was Japan's last chance to achieve the crushing victory that might force the Americans to negotiate. As Toyoda himself stated to his staff, the fate of the empire rested on this battle. The opportunity came in June 1944, when American forces began landing on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. The Marianas were vital to Japan. Their loss would place American bombers within range of the home islands and sever the connection between Japan and its southern territories. Toyoda ordered the mobile fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Ozawa, to sortie and engage the American invasion force. Ozawa's force, while impressive in roster, was fundamentally compromised before it left port. The 9 carriers and their supporting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers represented the concentrated strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But many of Ozawa's pilots were so inexperienced that they struggled with basic carrier operations. Landing on a moving deck at sea, a skill that pre-war pilots had mastered through hundreds of practice landings, was still uncertain for many of the replacement aviators. And the American submarine force, reading Japanese radio traffic and alerted to the fleet's movements, was positioning itself to intercept. The battle that followed, fought on June 19th and 20th, 1944, would be remembered by different names. The Americans called it the Battle of the Philippine Sea. They also called it, with grim humor that reflected the one-sided nature of the aerial combat, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Ozawa and the surviving officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force. The first American submarine strikes came before the carrier battle properly began. USS Albacore torpedoed the new fleet carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most modern carrier, on the morning of June 19th. Poor damage control led to gasoline vapor explosions that consumed the ship, and she sank that afternoon, taking down 1,600 men. Hours later, USS Kavala torpedoed and sank the veteran fleet carrier Shokaku. 2 of Ozawa's 9 carriers were gone before his aircraft had achieved anything. The aerial combat was worse. Ozawa launched 4 massive strikes, totaling over 370 aircraft against the American task force. American radar detected the incoming raids at ranges exceeding 100 miles, giving fighter directors time to position Hellcat fighters for interception. The result was slaughter. Inexperienced Japanese pilots flying inferior aircraft against a prepared defense supported by radar direction and new proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells achieved almost nothing. The first raid of 69 aircraft was met by Hellcats that shot down 42 of them. The attacks continued through the day, each one disrupted and decimated before reaching the American carriers. By nightfall on June 19th, Ozawa had lost over 300 carrier aircraft. 30 American planes had been lost in air combat. The entire day's effort had resulted in minor damage to a single American battleship. It was, in terms of aerial combat, perhaps the most one-sided victory in naval aviation history. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Ozawa tried to retreat during the night, but American scout planes located his fleet on the afternoon of June 20th. Admiral Mitchell, determined not to let the Japanese escape, launched a long-range strike despite the late hour and the certainty that many aircraft would have to return after dark. American dive bombers and torpedo planes struck the retreating Japanese fleet, sinking the light carrier Hio and damaging 2 other carriers. Returning in darkness with fuel tanks nearly empty, American aviators faced the dangerous task of landing on carriers at night. Mitchell ordered the task force to turn on all lights, ignoring the risk of submarine attack, to guide his pilots home. Many planes still ditched in the ocean, but intensive rescue operations saved most of the air crews. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended, Ozawa's fleet was in full retreat. 3 carriers sunk, 2 more heavily damaged, and over 400 aircraft destroyed. The mobile fleet had ceased to exist as an offensive force. More critically for Japan, the skilled aviators who had survived earlier battles and formed the experienced core of the air groups were largely gone now. The few carriers that remained would spend the rest of the war in port, unable to form effective air groups or lacking the fuel to sortie. In his compartment aboard Zuikaku, Ozawa compiled his report for Tokyo. The numbers told their own story. But it was the intelligence assessment of American carrier strength that must have struck him with particular force. The Americans had 15 carriers in the battle. According to intelligence estimates, they would have 24 by year's end, with more under construction. Japan, having strained every resource since Midway, had managed to complete 6 carriers during that same period, 6 against America's 24. The mathematics were inescapable. This was not a matter of fighting spirit or tactical skill. This was industrial capacity translated directly into naval power. For every carrier Japan could build, America built 4. For every pilot Japan could train, America trained 10, and rotated them through training squadrons to pass on their experience. For every ton of steel Japan could allocate to naval construction, America allocated 5, and still had surplus for merchant ships, tanks, and bombers. Ozawa understood, with the clarity that comes only from experiencing defeat, that Japan had never been fighting a war it could win through military means. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor had set in motion a process that was now approaching its inevitable conclusion. Every Japanese victory in the war's first 6 months had bought time, nothing more. And now time has run out. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared awakening was fully roused, and its productive capacity was overwhelming. Japanese resistance not through any single decisive battle, but through the steady, inexorable accumulation of material superiority. The war would continue for another 14 months after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese forces would fight with desperation and ferocity at Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Kamikaze pilots would damage dozens of American ships, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The carriers that might have contested American naval dominance were gone, sunk or uselessly moored for lack of aircraft and pilots. The pilots who might have flown them were dead or hopelessly outnumbered, and the industrial base that might have sustained a long war had never existed in the first place. In the years after the war, when historians and analysts examined Japanese decision-making, they would return repeatedly to this fundamental miscalculation. Japanese leadership had made a strategic assumption that proved catastrophically wrong. They had believed that superior fighting spirit, tactical skill, and short-term, military success could compensate for massive disparities in industrial capacity. They had believed America lacked the will for a long war. And they had believed, or perhaps hoped, that the productive capabilities they knew America possessed in theory would not manifest in practice before Japan could secure its conquests and negotiate from a position of strength. The intelligence reports that reached Tokyo in the weeks following the Philippine Sea disaster painted a picture that naval staff officers found difficult to accept. Not because the information was unclear, but because accepting it required acknowledging that the war had been mathematically unwinnable from the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. The numbers, laid out in dry bureaucratic language, told a story of industrial imbalance so profound that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome it. Consider the specific timeline of American carrier construction. The Essex-class program had ordered 32 carriers total. By the time Ozawa retreated from the Philippine Sea, 18 were either commissioned or nearing completion. The remaining orders would continue into 1945, though not all would be finished before war's end. But the 18 operational Essex-class carriers represented more combat power than the entire pre-war Japanese carrier fleet at its zenith. And these were merely the fleet carriers. The Americans had also converted 9 Cleveland-class cruiser hulls into Independence-class light carriers, adding another rapid construction carrier type that could operate effectively with the fleet. The construction speed defied Japanese comprehension. USS Essex herself, commissioned in December 1942, had been built in roughly 15 months. USS Lexington, the second of the class, took 16 months. USS Bunker Hill took 17. The average construction time hovered around 18 months, from keel laying to commissioning. This was not dotu, merely fast by Japanese standards. It was fast by any historical standard. Pre-war carriers worldwide typically required 3 to 4 years to build. The Americans had cut that time in half, while simultaneously increasing the size and capability of the ships. How had they achieved this? The answer lay in the application of industrial principles that Japan's artisanal shipbuilding tradition had never embraced. American shipyards prefabricated major components in workshops, then assembled them on the building ways like pieces of an enormous puzzle. They used standardized parts wherever possible, allowing multiple yards to build to the same specifications without custom fitting. They employed electric welding extensively rather than riveting, which was faster and required fewer skilled workers. They organized work crews in shifts that kept construction proceeding around the clock. And critically, they had access to seemingly unlimited quantities of steel, aluminum, copper, and other essential materials. The contrast with Japanese carrier construction could not have been more stark. Of the 6 carriers Japan completed between Midway and the Philippine Sea, only one, Taiho, was a purpose-built fleet carrier laid down specifically as such. She took 32 months to complete and incorporated armor protection that made her the most survivable Japanese carrier design of the war. But her sophisticated design and heavy armor came at the cost of construction time and resources. When USS Albacore's torpedoes struck her on June 19, 1944, poor damage control negated all that expensive protection. Gasoline vapor from a ruptured fuel line ignited, and the resulting explosion tore the ship apart. She sank, taking her experienced captain, hundreds of crew, and Vice Admiral Ozawa's staff officers with her. The other Japanese carriers completed during this period were conversions, or smaller vessels, built with compromises forced by material shortages. The Com, 3 Unryu-class carriers, Unryu, Amagi, and Katsuragi, were laid down in late 1942, but took nearly 2 years to complete. Even then, they entered service undermanned, with incomplete anti-aircraft armament and lacking sufficient aircraft to fill their hangars. Amagi was commissioned in August 1944 but never operated aircraft at sea. She was moored at Kure, where American carrier aircraft found her in July 1945, bombed her repeatedly, and left her capsized in shallow water. Katsuragi was commissioned in October 1944 but likewise never saw combat operations. She survived the war only because she was hidden in inland sea waters and escaped detection by American search planes. The largest carrier Japan completed during the war was the Shinano, the converted 3rd Yamato-class battleship. At 72,000 tons fully loaded, she was the largest carrier yet built, a record she would hold for a decade. But her conversion from battleship to carrier was itself a compromise. Work on her battleship hull had begun in May 1940, but in December 1941, with the hull only partially complete, the Navy suspended construction to decide her fate. After Midway, the decision was made to convert her to a carrier. The conversion took over 2 years, complicated by the need to work around existing battleship structure and by the same material shortages that plagued all Japanese construction. Shinano was finally commissioned in November 1944, though her fitting out was incomplete. The Navy, desperate to move her from Yokosuka to Kure, where she could be finished in relative safety from American air raids, ordered her to sea with an inexperienced crew and unfinished watertight integrity. On the night of November 29th, barely 10 days after commissioning, the American submarine USS Archerfish intercepted her. Commander Joseph Enright fired a full salvo of 6 torpedoes. 4 struck home. The damage should have been survivable for a ship of Shinano's size and design, but poor training of the damage control teams and incomplete watertight subdivision allowed progressive flooding. After several hours of futile effort to save her, Shinano capsized and sank, taking 1,400 men with her. She had been operational for 10 days. She never launched or recovered an aircraft. The story of Shinano encapsulates the tragedy of Japan's carrier program. She represented an enormous investment of resources, skilled labor, and time. Her potential combat power was significant, but she was sent to sea incomplete, with an untrained crew, and lost before she could contribute anything to the war effort. Had she survived and completed her fitting out, there were insufficient aircraft and pilots available to form an effective air group for her anyway. She would have joined the other surviving Japanese carriers moored uselessly in port, consuming fuel and resources while contributing nothing. By contrast, American carrier construction continued to accelerate, even as the war's outcome became clear. Essex-class carriers continued joining the fleet through 1945. The Midway-class carriers, even larger than the Essex-class and incorporating additional armor protection, were under construction. USS Midway herself would be commissioned in September 1945, too late to see combat, but representing the next generation of American carrier design. The industrial machine that produced these ships was so productive that it actually exceeded the Navy's ability to crew them. Several Essex-class hulls that were near completion at war's end were mothballed rather than commissioned because there was no operational need for additional carriers once Japan's defeat became imminent. This production disparity extended beyond carriers to every category of warship. During the entire war, Japan commissioned 31 destroyers. The United States commissioned 365. Japan commissioned 5 light cruisers and no heavy cruisers during the war. The United States commissioned 46 large, heavy, and light cruisers. The pattern repeated across battleships, submarines, auxiliaries, and merchant ships. In every category, American production outpaced Japanese construction by factors of 5 to 10. The implications went far beyond simple numbers. Each American carrier that joined the fleet was supported by a supply chain that could keep her at sea indefinitely. Fleet oilers met the carriers at designated points to refuel ships and aircraft. Ammunition ships replenished expended ordnance. Supply vessels brought food, spare parts, and replacement aircraft. Repair ships provided sophisticated workshop facilities that could fix battle damage or mechanical failures without requiring a return to port. This logistics network, called the fleet train, was itself larger than many nations' entire navies. It represented an understanding of modern warfare that emphasized sustainability and operational tempo over brief, decisive engagements. Japan never developed a comparable logistics system. Japanese carriers sortied from home bases, operated until their fuel or supplies were exhausted, then returned to port. This tied Japanese naval operations to fixed bases and predictable patterns. It also meant that damaged ships, even if they survived the trip home, might sit in dock for months waiting for repairs because yard capacity was limited and materials scarce. American carriers, by contrast, could operate for months without returning to port. Damaged ships could receive temporary repairs from the repair vessels, sufficient to keep them operational until scheduled overhauls. The difference was not merely logistical, it was philosophical. American naval strategy assumed continuous operations sustained by industrial production. Japanese strategy assumed brief, decisive battles followed by consolidation. This philosophical difference reflected the societies that produced these navies. American culture in the 1940s emphasized efficiency, standardization, and mass production. The assembly line principles that Henry Ford had pioneered in automobile manufacturing pervaded American industry. The idea that complex machines could be produced in large numbers through systematized processes was fundamental to American industrial identity. When that approach was applied to warship construction, the results proved revolutionary. Japanese culture, by contrast, emphasized craftsmanship, attention to detail, and the creation of unique, superior products. Japanese swords were famous for their quality, achieved through processes that took months or years per blade. Japanese naval construction reflected similar values. Ships were built by skilled workers who took pride in their craft. But this artisanal approach could not compete with industrial mass production once war demanded quantity as well as quality. The Americans also possessed advantages in raw materials that Japan could never overcome. The United States was largely self-sufficient in steel, aluminum, copper, oil, coal, and most other materials essential for modern warfare. When additional resources were needed, the vast American merchant fleet and protected Atlantic sea lanes allowed imports from around the world. Japan, by contrast, was desperately dependent on imported resources. The oil that fueled her ships and aircraft came from the Dutch East Indies, thousands of miles away across waters increasingly dominated by American submarines. Steel required iron ore from Manchuria or Southeast Asia. Even food supplies had to be imported to feed the home islands. American submarines, reading Japanese codes and directed to intercept specific convoys, were systematically destroying Japan's merchant fleet. Each tanker sunk meant less fuel oil for the Navy. Each freighter sunk meant fewer raw materials for factories. By 1944, Japan's merchant tonnage had been reduced by more than half. The shipyards that should have been building carriers were instead building smaller escort vessels to protect the dwindling merchant fleet, and even then, they could not build ships fast enough to replace losses. This strangling of Japan's maritime supply lines was perhaps the most decisive campaign of the Pacific War, yet it received little attention compared to the dramatic carrier battles. But for Japanese planners, the implications were inescapable. Without oil, the combined fleet could not sortie. Without raw materials, factories could not produce aircraft or ships. Without merchant shipping, the resources of the southern territories could not reach Japan. The empire was starving itself, while American industry grew stronger. Vice Admiral Ozawa, reflecting on the Philippine Sea battle in the months that followed, understood that he had been asked to accomplish the impossible. His pilots were brave. His ships were well designed within the constraints of Japanese industrial capacity. His tactical plans were reasonable given the forces available, but he had been sent into battle against an enemy that enjoyed such overwhelming material superiority that no amount of tactical skill could compensate. It was as if he had been asked to win a marathon while carrying a heavy pack, while his opponent ran unencumbered, and the finish line kept moving further away. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier operations effectively ceased. The surviving carriers, those few that had escaped sinking or severe damage, remained in port. There were no aircraft to fill their hangars. The factories that produced carrier aircraft were increasingly disrupted by American air raids. Trained pilots were so scarce that the Navy had begun training kamikaze units, reasoning that teaching young pilots to crash their planes into ships was faster than teaching them the complex skills needed for carrier operations. The carriers still afloat were employed as decoys in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Admiral Ozawa commanded a force of 4 carriers, with only 116 aircraft among them, roughly the number a single large American carrier might embark. His orders were to sail south from Japan and allow himself to be detected, drawing the American carrier force north, while other Japanese forces attacked the invasion fleet off the Philippines. The plan worked in that Ozawa successfully lured Admiral Halsey's carriers north, but the resulting engagement destroyed Ozawa's force without achieving the larger strategic goal. The carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, were all sunk, taking with them the last remnants of Japanese carrier aviation. Zuikaku's sinking was particularly symbolic. She had been present at Pearl Harbor, at the Coral Sea, and at the Philippine Sea. She was the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force. As she rolled over and sank, her crew reportedly sang the national anthem while standing at attention on her sinking deck. It was a scene of tremendous personal courage that exemplified everything the Japanese military valued about fighting spirit and dedication. It was also utterly meaningless in strategic terms. Zuikaku's loss changed nothing about the war's outcome. That had been determined by industrial capacity, not by courage. The carriers that survived later Gulf remained in port for the rest of the war. Ryuho was bombed and burned at Kure in March 1945. Junyo, Katsuragi, and the hybrid carrier battleships Issei and Hyuga were all caught in port during the massive American carrier raids of July 1945 and bombed repeatedly. Some survived as hulks, others sank at their moorings. None ever operated aircraft again. They had become, in effect, expensive steel coffins, monuments to Japan's failed attempt to compete with American industrial might. The final accounting is stark. From Pearl Harbor to the surrender, Japan operated or completed 18 carriers of all types. 14 were sunk during the war, most in the battles of 1944. The United States built 24 Essex-class fleet carriers during the same period, plus 9 Independence-class light carriers, plus numerous escort carriers, plus the beginning of the Midway-class super carriers. And the American carriers that survived the war, unlike their Japanese counterparts, continued operating for decades. USS Lexington was not decommissioned until 1991, 5 decades after her keel was laid, the longest-serving carrier in history. The story of the carrier race between Japan and America is often told as a tale of military strategy, tactical innovation, and the personal courage of pilots and crews on both sides. All of those elements mattered. But they mattered at the margins. The fundamental story is one of industrial capacity applied to warship construction. Japan could not build carriers fast enough to replace losses. America could build them faster than Japan could sink them. That disparity, more than any battle or campaign, determined the war's outcome in the Pacific. For Japanese naval officers like Ozawa, confronting this reality must have been psychologically devastating. They had spent their professional lives studying war, mastering tactics, training for the decisive battle that would determine Japan's fate. They had achieved remarkable successes in the war's early months, validating their training and doctrine. And then they watched as those successes were systematically erased, not by superior American tactics or strategy, but by superior American production. What makes this story particularly poignant is that the disparity was known, or should have been known, before the war began. Admiral Yamamoto had tried to warn the government. Intelligence reports had quantified American industrial capacity. Any Japanese, the officer who had visited America, could see the potential. But the decision to go to war was made anyway, based on the assumption that fighting spirit and tactical skill would compensate for material disadvantage, or that American will would break before American industry could fully mobilize. Both assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. American will, far from breaking, was strengthened by the Pearl Harbor attack, and American industry mobilized with a speed and scope that exceeded even optimistic pre-war estimates. The sleeping giant was indeed awakened, and his productive capacity proved overwhelming. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Wars are not fought in the abstract. They are fought with steel and oil, with ships and aircraft, with trained personnel and functioning supply chains. Superior morale and tactical skill can win battles, but sustained industrial production wins wars. The side that can build more ships, train more pilots, produce more fuel, and maintain larger supply chains will, over time, grind down any opponent that lacks equivalent capacity. Japan's carrier program was doomed from the start, not because Japanese engineers lacked skill or Japanese workers lacked dedication, but because the industrial base simply could not support the construction rates needed to compete. Building 6 carriers while America built 24 was not a failure. It was the maximum achievable given the constraints of resources, infrastructure, and industrial capacity. The real failure was strategic. choosing to fight a war that required industrial capacity Japan did not possess. Vice Admiral Ozawa survived the war. He retired from the Navy after the surrender and lived quietly until his death in 1966. In interviews after the war, he rarely discussed the Battle of the Philippine Sea directly. When pressed, he acknowledged that Japanese pilots had been inadequately trained, that material shortages had compromised ship readiness, and that the American force had been overwhelmingly superior. But there is a photograph of Ozawa, taken after the war, where he is looking at a model of an American Essex-class carrier. His expression is difficult to read, but those who knew him said it showed not anger or resentment, but a kind of resigned understanding. He was looking at the physical manifestation of the industrial disparity that had decided the war. 6 carriers, against 24. Mathematics had never been in Japan's favor. The surviving American carriers, meanwhile, went on to long and distinguished careers. Several fought in Korea, supporting United Nations forces with airstrikes along the coast. Many were modernized in the 1950s with angled flight decks and steam catapults, allowing them to operate jet aircraft. Some served in Vietnam, their aircraft striking targets in North Vietnam and providing support for ground forces in the south. The last Essex-class carrier in service, USS Lexington, served as a class training carrier for naval aviators until 1991, 50 years after the class was designed. Today, 4 Essex-class carriers are preserved as museum ships. USS Yorktown sits at Patriots Point in South Carolina. USS Intrepid is moored in New York City. USS Hornet is in Alameda, California, and USS Lexington is in Corpus Christi, Texas. Visitors walking these ships can see the massive flight decks, the cramped ready rooms where pilots waited for launch orders, the combat information centers where radar operators tracked incoming raids. These ships are monuments not merely to naval aviation, but to American industrial capacity. Each one represents 16 to 20 months of concentrated industrial effort by thousands of workers. And each one is a reminder that 24 such ships were built in the span of 4 years. There are no preserved Japanese carriers. All were sunk or scrapped. The closest approximation is the wreck of Akagi, located in 1999, resting upright in more than 18,000 feet of water northwest of Midway. Underwater photographs show her flight deck collapsed into the hangar spaces below, her hull corroded by decades of salt water. She is a grave, not a museum. Her story, and the story of Japan's carrier program, exists now in archives and memories, a cautionary tale about the consequences of miscalculating industrial capacity when planning for war. The broader lesson remains relevant. In any prolonged conflict between industrialized nations, productive capacity ultimately determines outcomes. Technology matters, strategy matters, leadership matters, but the ability to produce ships, aircraft, weapons, and supplies in quantities sufficient to sustain operations over years matters more. Japan learned this lesson at terrible cost. The 6 carriers they built between Midway and the Philippine Sea represented heroic efforts by workers and engineers operating under severe constraints. But heroic effort could not overcome mathematics. 24 carriers will always defeat 6 carriers, all other factors being roughly equal. Admiral Ozawa's realization in that cramped compartment aboard Zuikaku, looking at the columns of numbers that showed 6 Japanese carriers against 24 American ones, was the realization that Japan had fought a war it could never win. The courage of pilots, the skill of captains, the dedication of workers, all of these mattered. But they mattered within constraints established by industrial capacity, and those constraints, set long before the first shot was fired, had doomed Japan from the beginning. The final irony is that Japan today, in the 21st century, has rebuilt itself into an industrial powerhouse. Japanese shipyards are among the most productive in the world. Japanese manufacturing is synonymous with quality and efficiency. Japanese automobiles, electronics, and machinery are exported globally. The industrial capacity that Japan lacked in the Tarsals, 1940s has been developed over the post-war decades. But it came too late to change the outcome of the war that was decided by arithmetic as much as by combat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.